So what exactly is an algal bloom? An algal bloom is when an exponential increase in algae density occurs in an aquatic system. These blooms are what cause that murky green water that you often see when you search up eutrophic lakes. A body of water that has experienced algal blooming often has algae growing in clumps floating on top of the water with a gelatinous coating. Although algal blooms could occur naturally, a large amount of these blooms, such as the ones in Newport Bay, are primarily caused by the abundance of nutrient pollution. In addition to the negative impacts of algal blooms, as we will later explain, there are also harmful algal blooms, also known as HABs, that further increase the damages done from algal blooms. Commonly seen as a red layer above the water's surface, these algal blooms also negatively impact aquatic ecosystems. Before we discuss these impacts, it is important to know the specific causes of these bloomings. When discussing algal blooms, it is important to discuss what algae is. Algae are microscopic organisms that live in aquatic environments. These organisms can be found in both freshwater and saltwater, and even mixes of both that are called brackish water. Algae's main role in an environment is to create oxygen and keep the aquatic ecosystem alive and running.
Some human activities, such as agricultural runoff or poorly functioning septic systems, can make blooms more likely, and excessive amounts of nutrients within a lake can markedly increase the risk and severity of algal blooms. However, excessive nutrients may not lead to a bloom if other factors are unfavorable. For example, in a turbid shallow lake, there may be insufficient light to support a bloom, despite having high nutrient concentrations and warm water. In many cases, a set of unique environmental conditions occur in a water body, which can lead to particular species dominating and triggering a bloom. While bloom formation is water body specific, the most common factors for bloom formation are timing, nutrients, temperature, light, and stable conditions. Algal blooms most often occur in the late summer and early fall. However, they can occur at any time of the year, even under the ice. Blooms typically last from several days to a few weeks, but can sometimes last as long as several months if the environmental conditions are favorable. Nutrients. Phosphorus and nitrogen are essential to algae production, and these nutrients encourage the growth of algae in water bodies. Phosphorus is the key nutrient limiting algal growth in the majority of BC lakes. Increased concentrations of nutrients often lead to increased algal production and increased risk of a bloom forming. This process of nutrient enrichment in a water body is called eutrophication, which can be exacerbated by anthropogenic influences such as shoreline development, certain farming practices, wastewater and industrial effluent, or urban and stormwater runoff. Note that algae blooms can also occur in water bodies where nutrients are fairly low, but are more common when nutrient concentrations, especially phosphorus, are high. Temperature. Blooms usually develop during the warmer months of the year when water temperatures are higher. Cyanobacteria prefer warmer water and have competitive advantage over other algae at temperatures over 25 degrees Celsius. Light. Sufficient light is also required for algae to grow and form high enough densities to bloom. The availability of light is largely influenced by the light penetration and mix dynamics within the water body. Stable conditions. Generally, calmer waters and low wind conditions favor algal bloom development. Stable surface water conditions and less water column mixing promotes thermal stratification in water bodies. Cyanobacteria prefer these stable water conditions with minimal turbulence.
The main impacts of algal blooms involve the reduction of oxygen capacity for other aquatic species, the disturbance of other species through the immense presence of algae, and the harmful algal blooms that produce toxins. For instance, algal blooms essentially create dead zones in which they block out sunlight and consume oxygen. Specifically, these algal blooms consume oxygen from the ecosystem when they die and decompose in the water, reducing the availability of oxygen for other aquatic species that depend on it for survival. Additionally, as they cover the surface of the water, they take up sunlight, preventing primary producers such as kelp from being able to use sunlight for photosynthesis, meaning there's a lack of energy available to support primary consumers like small prey fish, and therefore a lack of energy for the higher trophic levels that feed off these fish. They can clog up fish gills, which causes fish populations to die in the area or escape to another dangerous ecosystem in which they are not accustomed to the temperature and salinity. Not only do these algal blooms deplete the aforementioned resources essential for the survival of other aquatic species, but harmful algal blooms can also produce toxins in an ecosystem. Harmful algal blooms occur when there is a large increase in algae that produces toxins in a single body of water. These algal blooms can create excess toxins that are consumed by small fish and shellfish, and then are moved up the food chain where the bioaccumulation impacts large animals like sea lions, turtles, dolphins, birds, and manatees. It is also important to note how algal blooms impact human populations, and not just those who eat the poison fish. Algal blooms pose a direct threat to human water consumption. Specifically, algal blooms which reduce oxygen start to deplete the quality of potential drinking water, requiring more investment in order to sustain safe water quality. If local governments do not invest into filtering out these chemicals, then people living near algal bloom waters may experience worsened water quality.
One major water ecosystem that is being impacted by algal blooming is Newport Bay. The sewage treated in the water by Newport Bay, although meant to be fully treated through water facilities, still contain nitrogen. This nitrogen in treated sewage is causing the growth of algae due to its abundance and nutrient density. In addition to this failure to properly treat the sewage, the surrounding agricultural fields, residential yards, greenbelts, and golf courses also contribute to the algal blooming of Newport Bay because the fertilizer used in these areas tends to run off in the water through rainstorms. Although these blooms could be caused by the natural rising of groundwater in which agricultural waste is stored, the main controllable source of these blooms is the nitrogen from sewage and fertilizer. As these algal blooms die, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the Newport Bay aquatic system is reduced, as it is consumed by the algae when decomposing. This lower dissolved oxygen level can cause the water to lack oxygen to sustain local fish and other aquatic organism populations. This lack of sustainability of dissolved oxygen often leads to an imbalanced food chain that will only further destroy the ecosystem. To specify, the small aquatic animals pass away due to the lack of dissolved oxygen levels, meaning the larger consumers and predators will not have enough energy supply and would therefore be forced to relocate or starve to death, which depletes the entire ecosystem in Newport Bay's water.
Hi, welcome to Newport Bay News. My name is Daniel Nikolienko, and today I'm going to be interviewing a fellow Newport Bay citizen. What's your name?
Claire Wu.
Claire Wu. What are your observations of algal blooming in Newport Bay?
Algal blooming have completely overtook the aquatic ecosystem of Newport Bay. The water is covered with a murky green coating, and there have been reports from local fisheries that many of the fish they have found were already dead or completely covered in algae. Not only does this impact fishermen, but many visitors or any local residents of Newport Bay, as they have to deal with the funky smell that comes from the algae rotting.
So Claire Wu, what are the biggest challenges in reducing algal blooms that you've seen in Newport Bay? And do you think there are any new limits in implementing any solutions?
I think that the biggest challenge in reducing algal blooms in Newport Bay comes from the perspectives of local farmers here in Southern California. In order for these farmers to make profit, they need to use both fertilizers and irrigation to produce crops. Once the nutrients from the fertilizers are run off from either these irrigation systems or rainfall, they end up causing algal blooms in nearby waters. This means that algal blooms will be harder to reduce since farmers keep depending on fertilizers.
Oh, very solid point, thank you. So Claire, looking towards the future of Newport Bay, what do you think is essential to keeping the water quality clean?
I think that the Newport Bay should focus on what is causing the algal blooms to fix it. Specific nutrients such as phosphorus that increases the chance or support algal blooms must be removed. We can install buffers of shrubs and small trees in order to prevent agricultural runoff from reaching Newport Bay's waters. Overall, Newport Bay's water quality should be monitored and checked on every day to prevent further algal blooms and secure long-term water quality.
Thank you, and that was Newport Bay News with Claire Wu and Daniel Nikolienko. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bloom interviews. Today we have Claire Wu.
Oh, wait, how do you want it?
How do I know your name? I've known you for this whole class, pal.
No, in the interview!
I'm pretending to be. You're gonna say
Your name to walk out to.
Yeah.
My name. You guys are.
No, what I meant in the interviewing part.
Oh yeah, I was
Did you
just
say my
saying.
name?
I was just saying it as you.
The obvious, you know what? I don't know if you're